أعوذ بالله من الشيطان اللعين الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم أضم الله أجرنا وأجركم بمصابنا أبا عبد الله الحسين صلوات الله وسلامه عليه. Dearest respected brothers and sisters around the world, welcome back to the After Maghrib podcast. Assalamu alaikum, wherever you are watching from. Of course, the last few days have been heavy on our hearts, on our souls, as we mourned the tragic demise of Abu Abdullah al-Hussein salawatullahi wa salamuhu alayhi, and of course his family and beloved companions. But now in this season, post Ashura, there's a lot for us to reflect on. We must continue the message of Imam Hussain and start to implement some of the lessons we learned into our day-to-day lives between now and of course Arba'een, which is fast approaching. Alhamdulillah, we've had a lot of majalis, and now's the chance really for us to take what we have learned and move forward. Today, inshallah, we have a very interesting discussion with, of course, a very special guest. But before we get there, as always, I'd like to introduce my dear co-host, Sayyid Ali. Assalamu alaikum. Assalam wa rahmatullah. How are you keeping, Sayyid?
Alhamdulillah, as you mentioned that, it's been post majalis, and I've, alhamdulillah, been blessed to attend every single night. But this year was a bit different. I made it my commitment to take my daughters with me to every majlis and anything Hussaini environment possible. So I had a very nice time, sharing Hussaini vibes, if I can use that, with the family this year.
Absolutely, yeah, no, alhamdulillah. And of course, there's so many majalis online, so much content to consume, and a lot of us will walk away from these nights with questions, in some cases misconceptions. And I think it's very important for us to discuss this. In doing so, inshallah, we've got the dear respected Sayed Mahdi Modarresi with us. Assalamu alaikum, Sayyidina.
Alaikum assalam.
Thank you very much for joining us.
Pleasure to be here.
Of course, many of us know, and we remember back in 2009, where of course you founded Ahlul Bayt TV, and now many years later we are here, alhamdulillah, and still able to serve. How, firstly, has your stay been in London? How's the community been for you?
Alhamdulillah. First of all, as far as the founding of the channel is concerned, it couldn't have happened without the sincere and dedicated team that came together, put in incredible effort. I mean, remember, this is 2009, which means that TV channels devoted to the Ahlul Bayt and their school and tashayyu' were unheard of. And so making this happen, getting it off the ground, was a monumental task. And so I think it's an injustice to say that I founded the channel. It was a group of people who came together and put in incredible hours, as you do now, and made it happen. As far as London is concerned and the community, it's beautiful, really. I mean, it's nothing like any other place in the world in terms of the sheer numbers. And of course, when you have a community that's this big, you also end up finding individuals who are, they remind you of what it's like to be a true Shia, a true follower of the Ahlul Bayt. It has its challenges, no doubt. There are emerging threats that we're facing, but as a community, it's wonderful.
Alhamdulillah.
Makes us feel proud.
Yeah.
You should.
Alhamdulillah. Said, of course, I mean, firstly on what you mentioned about Ahlul Bayt TV, it's mashallah, the founding of the channel and the establishment of the channel has brought so many people together, changed so many lives, and we hear these stories day in and day out. It's brought the three of us, in terms of Sayyid Mushtaba, Sayyid Ali and myself, together, and alhamdulillah, so many others as well. And I think a big part of why Ahlul Bayt TV has such an important role to play is because there are a lot of misconceptions that surround tashayyu', as you mentioned, Shi'ism and Islam in general. And in these days post Ashura, a lot of the questions start to emerge about the mission of Imam Hussain alayhi salam and why he did what he did. Perhaps, inshallah, a good place to start is to clarify a lot of the misconceptions, misrepresentations that maybe others from other schools have put forward, that Al-Imam alayhi salam traveled with the intention to regain Khilafah for himself. This is something we see a lot online, the comments on our posts and the sort of engagement we have. How would we address that when we're faced with this?
Address
the notion that the Imam fought for solely a political gain.
I think there have been claims, not just in the broader context, but also Shia researchers and historians have tried to make sense of Ashura. And I think something we need to keep in mind is that Ashura is such a life-altering event in human history that trying to process it has taken the better part of the last 14 centuries. It is not a small event that you can, quickly analyze and then dismiss as one thing or the other. It's made the most brilliant minds struggle to make sense of why Imam Hussain would do such a thing. Take his family, his children, the most vulnerable members of the Imam's household accompanied him. And it's specifically that point which negates the entire idea that Imam Hussain was there trying to secure some political position for himself, because even Western scholars have talked about this. Wilfred Madelong, who recently passed away, foremost expert on the history of Islam post the passing of the Holy Prophet, he says this. He's like, it doesn't make sense. If Imam Hussain was there trying to fight a political battle, then he would take along with him people who were loyal to him. There were individuals, across the Muslim world who would have lent their support had the Imam asked them. For instance, At-Tarammah, this is an interesting one actually, because At-Tarammah was a companion of the Imam. Before him, he was close to Imam Hassan and the commander of the faithful. And the Imam encounters him on his way toward Kufa. At-Tarammah was leaving Kufa, going back to his village and to his tribe. So the Imam invites him to join him. The interesting part is that Tarammah says to him, why would you go to Kufa accompanied just by a handful of your close companions and your family members, when in fact, if you give me a chance, if you come along with me, I can take you back to my tribe and I have 20,000 people who are ready to lay their lives for you. And he may have been correct in that assessment that, maybe his tribe would in fact join him, because after all, he was the chief of his tribe. Had this been a political power struggle, the Imam would have taken a completely different route. The Imam would have tried to recruit and train actual soldiers who would go with him. He probably wouldn't go to Kufa. He would go somewhere else, perhaps Yemen or some other part of the Muslim nation where there were people who were more sympathetic to the Imam. But for him to take his family and his children, because he's trying to fight some political battle to attain some kind of office within the Islamic Caliphate, it just doesn't add up. That's number one. Number two, if you look at the Imam's own statements, how do you know what the Imam's objectives are unless you hear what he has to say about it? And the Imam openly and clearly stated on numerous occasions that the tyrant Yazid is someone who represents the very antithesis of the moral example that Islam would want a leader to possess. He is someone who's a drunkard. He's incestuous. He's promiscuous. He is filthy down to the very core. And what I'm trying to do is, I'm not out looking for an adventure. لم أخرج أشرا ولا بطرا وإنما خرجت لطلب الإصلاح في أمة جدي. I'm intent on reforming the nation of my grandfather. And if that means that the Imam would have to go and fight the tyrant, again, you can define that as a political struggle because you're fighting the head of the pyramid. You're fighting the person who's in charge, the ruler of the time. But the Imam's objectives were certainly not political.
Interesting.
Yeah, it's not political, and you're right. And I think we see that in the time where when Imam Hussain wanted to make his way towards Kufa, it wasn't for power. I mean, history shows us that he wanted to answer the call of those in Kufa, for example.
Right.
But this is a question I want to ask when it comes to this point, Sayed.
Sure.
Is that we always, have this accusation thrown at us, and sometimes we don't know how to answer it. And I think it's important that we clarify this today for everyone listening. And I say it's important, why? Because a lot of our comments on our posts, they always say the Shia killed Imam Hussain. If people in Kufa were the lovers of Imam Hussain, who claim to love the Ahlul Bayt, who claim to follow the path of Muhammad Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wa sallam, why would they ask Imam al-Hussain to come and then betray him? And were they Shia?
So that's, as you said, it's a very old trope that's been leveled against the Shia.
It still goes on. If you see our socials, when it
Right.
comes to our podcast, now is the high time for them.
Yeah,
When it's
yeah. I mean, my point is,
Yeah.
it's not some trailblazing new discovery. It's
Yeah.
been around since the time of the Umayyad dynasty.
Okay.
And something we need to understand, that a lot of us understand, but I think the broader Muslim community needs to appreciate the fact that when you're looking at Bani Umayyah, when you're looking at Yazid and his successors, the Khulafa, these are people who had committed an egregious, grievous, heinous crime, killing the son of Rasulullah. And so it's like someone who's just beaten his wife. If you take that person to court, what are they going to say? Their defense is probably going to be, especially if they're caught in the act, they'll probably try to undermine it. They'll say things like, "Oh, I didn't really beat her. It was just an argument. We were having fun before, and then it kind of escalated into an argument. And then, she pushed me, and I pushed her back, and I still love her. I don't have a problem with her. It's probably her brother, that guy. He's always had it for me, and things like that." That's basically what Bani Umayyah were trying to do. On the one hand, they created this story, this fantasy, that Imam al-Hussein hadn't been killed. Imam al-Hussein, in fact, ascended to the heavens just like Jesus did.
Ajib.
So this was one narrative that they tried to push, which is why our traditions, when you look at the ziyarat of the Ahlul Bayt, they're very emphatic about the fact that Imam al-Hussein was killed, because they're trying to respond to this fantasy. Ashhadu annaka qutilta walam tamut. You were killed. I bear witness that you were killed. Why would you say that? Of course he was killed, right? There's no question. But no, back then there was this misconception that the Imam was never killed. He ascended to the heavens. He was raised up to God. Ashhadu annaka qutilt walam tamut. But you never died, right? Ashhadu anna hadha masra'u badanik. I bear witness that this is where your body was brought to an end, that you were killed on this land, right? But your spirit and your memory and your legacy exudes with life, and it's what gives everything else its life. So that's one narrative that they tried to push. The other narrative was that Yazid wasn't responsible. So Yazid himself, in fact, that was the first thing that he declared after the sermon of Lady Zainab alayhi salam and Imam al-Sajjad. The tables were turned, right? We have very specific reports about how, number one, when Lady Zainab spoke, everyone went quiet. Everyone was silenced, including the bells around the necks of the animals. In other words, there was such a deafening silence. Everyone was focused on Lady Zainab and what she had to say. And her sermon is famous for completely exposing and disrobing Yazid and his tyranny. Then Imam al-Sajjad alayhi salam comes, and he delivers such a fiery sermon in the presence of this vicious pharaoh that ultimately led to everyone bursting into tears. Everyone was crying at the end of the sermon of Imam al-Sajjad, right? When he started saying that, I am the son of the one who was slaughtered in broad daylight. I was the one who was deprived of water. I was the one who was left without clothes on the plains of Karbala. I was this and that. And everybody was crying at the end. Crying in the sense that they're sympathizing with Imam al-Hussein, and obviously taking
the
a
guilt.
stance against Yazid. There was obviously a sense of guilt, but it was clear that the tables had turned. Everyone knew who was responsible for this crime and who the victim was. The first thing Yazid does is he says, but I didn't do it. It was Ubaydullah ibn Ziyad. I asked him to apprehend Imam Hussain and bring him to me so that we could negotiate, right? It was never, there were never any instructions for him to kill the Imam. And so not only this, but he went a step further. He said, you know what? Imam Hussain is related to me, right? We're Bani Umayyad, they're Bani Hashim, our family trees meet at some point. And so I have to be consoled now. And so he organized a majlis for 3 days and invited all the top officials as well as the general public to come and offer condolences to him. He said, Hada Shahidu Quraysh, Qatilu Quraysh. We're from the same tribe. So that was another narrative. The other more persistent narrative is the one that you alluded to, which is that, you know what, if anybody killed him, it was the Shia. But here are a few questions to think about. Number one, the army of Sham, were they also Shia? Right? On the 9th of Muharram, the point of no return, if we could use that expression, for Imam al-Hussein and his companions and his camp, was the 9th of Muharram, when his camp was completely sealed off and reinforcements joined Umar ibn Sa'd from Sham. If we say that the people of Kufa were Shia, are we going to make the same claim about the people of Sham? Absolutely not. The people of Sham were brainwashed for decades by Muawiyah and Bani Umayyah. So that's number one. Number two, the actual individuals who participated in the killing of Imam al-Hussein alayhi salam, right? You hear names like Shibr ibn al-Jawshan, you hear Sinan ibn Anas, you hear Shabath ibn Rab'i. These individuals, anyone who reads their background and their story knows for a fact that they were never Shia. Shabath ibn Rab'i participated in some of the wars of Amir al-Mu'mineen. Sure, but that's not because he believed in the Imam. Because what's the definition of a Shia? The definition of a Shia is someone who believes that the Prophet left successors who are equal in rank with the Quran and who are proofs of God. Their every word is a divine injunction. Imamun, ma'sumun, muftarad al-ta'ah. His commandments are obligatory. They're not optional. Whatever they say, it's like the Prophet commanding you to do something. Would someone like that kill an Imam? Would someone like that even, I don't know, turn their back to the Imam, let alone harm him? It doesn't add up. It makes absolutely no sense. And these individuals that I mentioned, they might have been at some point or another with Imam Ali, but they were also with Imam Ali's enemies. They were also with Bani Umayyah. In other words, these were opportunistic imposters. These were individuals who were looking to get a piece of the cake. And so if it meant joining Imam Ali today, then they would do that. If it meant switching sides to someone else, they would do that as well. So to claim that the people of Kufa or those who killed Imam Hussein were all Shia is just preposterous. It's absurd. And the leaders, think about the fact that after Amir al-Mu'mineen, who was the governor of Kufa? Who did you have there? Who was in charge? Because ultimately, whoever's in charge is the one who pushes a certain narrative and tries to, brainwash and manipulate the masses to their advantage. You had Ziyad ibn Abi, who's certainly not a Shia, right? Ubaydullah ibn Ziyad, who was in Basra, certainly not a Shia. People of this caliber ruled over the city. And so while Imam Ali was the leader of the Muslim nation and Kufa was his capital city, it by no means suggests that everyone in Kufa was a Shia. The actual Shia of Imam Ali were either imprisoned, killed prior to the day of Ashura, like Maytham al-Tammar, right? Maqtal was in prison. And others also joined Imam al-Hussein alayhi salam, like Habib ibn Mudahir, Muslim ibn Awsaja, and others.
Interesting. Sayed, of course, after Ashura, we reflect on the day, on the Maqtal that we hear. And of course, if you're tuning into different centers and different communities, you'll hear different approaches to the Maqatil literature in the way it's presented and read as well. I have a kind of two-pronged question. The first being, after so many years, we're talking 1400 years, how can we firstly be sure that the Maqatil literature we read is accurate, and is there a preference? And number two, are there common misconceptions that you hear from your, if you, with respect from your end on the minbar, that you hear across the world from different communities, which are commonly stated having taken place on the Maqtal, which actually didn't happen or didn't take place?
Can I just, as a follow-up to the previous question, I wanted to add a couple of points. The first is, okay, they say that the Shia killed Imam Hussain back in the day. Mm-hmm. But today, who are the true followers of Imam Hussain? The ones that honor Imam Hussain, the ones that commemorate his tragedy, the ones that visit his shrine, right? I once said to a high-ranking official in a particular Muslim country, I won't mention it, but we got into this debate over Yazid and whether he was exonerated and whatnot. And I said to him, first of all, you're a security official. You know nothing about these things. You're not a historian. You're not a theologian. So don't, dip your toe into something that is way outside your field of expertise. The second thing is, I said, when it comes to Imam Hussain, is he just someone that's special to us? Do you care about Imam Hussain? Do you care about the fact that this was the Prophet's grandson? If you claim that you do and that you love him more than we do, fine, come and visit Imam Hussain. We invite every Muslim, regardless of affiliation, regardless of which sect they belong to, come and visit Imam Hussain. Honor him the way we do. In Karbala, during Ziyarat al-Arba'in, 1 billion meals are given out for free in honor of Imam Hussain. 1 billion. This is mind-boggling. Nothing like this happens anywhere in the world. It's never happened before. We do that. And we're not claiming that, somehow we're proud of this or anything. If you ask any of the people who serve Imam al-Hussein and his pilgrims, they'll say, we're just happy that Imam al-Hussein would accept us as slaves, as servants, right? So that's point number one. The other thing is, look, Imam al-Hussein himself said on the day of Ashura, Ya Shi'ata Ali Abi Sufyan, إن لم يكن لكم دين وكنتم لا تخافون المعاد فكونوا أحرارا في دنياكم. All followers of Al Abi Sufyan. Had they been Shia, they would have said, no. You know what? We're actual Shia, right? The Imam said, you are followers of Abi Sufyan. In other words, they were followers of the Khilafah. And yeah, some of them, like you were saying earlier, some of them in Kufa might have sympathized with the Imam. They might have liked him. They might have actually admired him, which you can say the same about every Muslim today, right?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
So it's like, every Sunni would say, we love the Ahlul Bayt. Every Shia would say, we love the Ahlul Bayt. So if somebody participated, obviously it wasn't Jews or Christians who came to kill the Imam. It wasn't Hindus. It was Muslims. And so just like today, those quote unquote so-called Muslims claim to love Imam al-Hussein, right? But to call them Shia would require additional proof. That's just absurd. Which is why, who was it who came, I think it was on his way back from Kufa, and he encountered the Imam. The Imam asked him, what's going on in Kufa? What's the situation? And he said to him, I'll be honest with you. قُلُوبُهُمْ مَعَكْ وَسُيُوفُهُمْ عَلَيْكَ. Yeah, they might sympathize, they might like you. Oh, he's the Prophet's grandson. But their swords are unsheathed in your face. They're trying to kill you. So that's one issue. As far as the question that you asked about the Maqtal, I think that's a very it's an all-encompassing topic. It's a very deep one, and I did a course a few years ago, an online course that's available on YouTube called Ashurology, in which the idea was to try and look at the Ashura narrative and verify the sources that are used to arrive at the stories that we hear today. And so for an in-depth discussion, I think it's a 4-part series, maybe 3 parts with a Q&A. I would highly encourage the viewers to go and watch that. So just look up Ashurology and you'll find it.
Can I ask, sorry, Sayed, just as a preempt, maybe to encourage people to listen to that, but Someone might say, what is the big deal? Do I need to know the small details of the Maqtal? If I know Imam died in this way and he died thirsty and his family and companions were killed?
No, absolutely not. In fact, that's a really good point that you're making, which is that, look, there are things that we have no dispute about.
Yeah.
These are beyond question. In fact, these are the biggest tragedies.
Yeah.
If we do differ on some of the details, they don't rise up to the gravity of these points that you just mentioned.
Right.
The very fact that Imam Hussain was killed is a big deal, right? The very fact that he was deprived of water, despite having access to it, is a big deal. The very fact that they killed his family, his children, his infant is a very big deal. Now, whether we disagree on some of the minute details, perhaps the conversations that took between Imam al-Hussein and Umar ibn Sa'd or Lady Zainab and Abu al-Fadl al-Abbas and so forth, they don't change anything, right? They don't change the narrative. They don't, they don't obstruct anything. They don't distort anything. That's a really good point. And if anybody has qualms or misconceptions or, any other negative reaction to the differences that we see, I would refer them back to this point, which is stick to the main events, which are beyond dispute. That's number one. As far as the narrative itself is concerned, look, we have incredibly reliable sources that we refer back to. Don't forget one thing. When it comes to the dates on which the Imams of the Ahlul Bayt were killed, there are a lot of different opinions. Not just the Imams of the Ahlul Bayt, but the Prophet himself. There are 7 or 8 different opinions as to when the Prophet died. Think about that for a moment. This is Rasulullah we're talking about.
Yeah.
This is the leader of this nation, God's final prophet. And yet, Ibn Hajar says it's this date. Ibn Mas'ud said it was in the month of Ramadan. A third person comes along and says, no, it's a completely different date, right? 7 or 8 different dates, including the days of the week on which the Prophet passed away. The Prophet died, or was martyred rather. And so if we have this many disagreements, don't you think there's going to be disagreements about some of the other details? But here's what's interesting. The only exception to this rule about different opinions is Imam al-Hussein. There's not a single person out there who disputes that Imam al-Hussein's martyrdom occurred on the day of Ashura of the first month of the Muslim year, the year 61 after Hijrah, right? Nobody disputes this. What does that tell you? It tells you that the events of the day of Ashura were so unambiguous. They're so clear. They were factual. These weren't things that people, had any disputes about. The reason for that is because this wasn't an ambush on the house of Fatima Zahra where you could get into the details of what happened inside that house. Yeah. Right? And
it was clear cut.
It happened in broad daylight. And it happened in front of 30,000 witnesses. Right? 30,000 people who were there to kill Imam al-Hussein. And they each saw much of what happened. But as far as the reliability of the narrative is concerned, you need to understand that the number one source is eyewitness reports. Right? When you have 30,000 witnesses to an event, it's not something you can deny. Right? You had people in the camp of Imam al-Hussein, individuals like Al-Dhahak al-Mashriqi, who was there, and he narrates many of the stories. The number 72, for instance, is ascribed to him, which is not accurate. The reason being that there were people who joined Imam al-Hussein afterwards, right? There were people who came from the side of Umar ibn Sa'd. There were people who joined Imam al-Hussein from Basra and perhaps Kufa. But Al-Dhahak al-Mashriqi is a source of the stories. You have Hamid ibn Muslim, who is kind of like a neutral journalist who was recording the events, and he had a keen interest on the most, on the finest details, including the fact that when Qasim Ibn Hassan, alayhim as-salam, when his sandal snapped, he said, "I will never forget that it was the right one." Wow. So it goes into that level of detail because it's his job. He's there literally to record all of the events in as much detail as possible. Exactly like a journalist, right? You also have people on the enemy side who, again, there were 30,000 of them. They witnessed all of these events take place, unfold right before their two eyes. And they would tell each other, they would verify the stories afterwards as well. A lot of them went back to Kufa and they would tell their families and their friends that this is what happened. And a lot of these stories were verifiable because, again, it's not just two eyewitnesses, but 30,000 of them. Then you had the testimonies of the perpetrators of the crimes and the heinous acts on the day of Ashura, who, when they were captured by Mukhtar al-Thaqafi, he would question them and they would tell on themselves, they would testify to their crimes. So you have all of these testimonials, you have all of these eyewitnesses. That's number one. Number two, you have the Imams of the Ahlul Bayt themselves, who, in the case of Imam Zayn al-Abidin and Imam al-Baqir, they were eyewitnesses in addition to the fact that they were Imams. And so when Imam al-Sadiq alayhi salam says that my grandfather Imam al-Hussain on the eve of Ashura spoke to his sister Zainab and said so and so, or when he was walking about with Nafi' ibn Hilal, he said such and such, or when Ali al-Akbar spoke to his father on their way to Karbala, this is what happened. These are the words of an infallible, inerrant Imam. Right? So it holds as much value as any juristic hukum, any juristic ruling, it has the same value. So that's another source. You also had people, don't forget, who were on the side of Imam al-Hussein, but were injured and captured, but never killed. One of them is an individual who was a servant of Rabab, salamullahi alayha, right? This person wasn't killed. He was injured. They took him. His tribe intervened. They didn't want to see him getting killed. And so they interceded for him. They took him. He was exiled. And within about a year, he died. So he was another source. And so based on all of this, the collection of the stories of Karbala began immediately after the event took place. You have Al-Asbagh ibn Nubata, who wrote a Maqtal. Maqtal meaning the passion narrative or the story of the killing of Imam al-Hussein alayhi salam. That's what Maqtal means for those people who don't know. Then you had Abu Lut ibn Abi Mukhnaf. Now, this person was also a historian. He had no bias whatsoever. Someone who was a professional and, collated all of the stories, brought them together, verified them, cross-checked them, and wrote his book. And the reason I say he wasn't biased and was a professional is because At-Tabari relies heavily on his narrative. Now, At-Tabari, being a Sunni, obviously wouldn't rely on somebody who was seen as being biased or Shia or what have you. And so there was no reason for the stories to be exaggerated. There was no way of doing that when you have this many eyewitnesses and this many testimonies, which could be easily referenced. And so after that, you have a very rigorous process of trying to put all of these different pieces together and arrive at a clear picture of what happened on the day of Ashura.
So sorry to interrupt you, but sorry, I know you have a question, Sayyid Ali. But the dramatization or knowing the fine details of the Maqtal and Ashura, what happened, could one argue, referring back to your first point, that generally speaking, not a big deal? But whether there were 72 or 118 companions, whether Ali al-Akbar was 28 or 22 or whatever it might be. Are these, obviously it's important for us to know historical facts when we're discussing infallibles, as you mentioned, and whatnot. But when we disseminate the message of Ashura to non-Muslims and to people who are wanting to learn, how important are those details to convey the message itself?
So you're right. On the one hand, those details are important because they pertain to something that's sacrosanct, right? They have to do with an event that shook the world, and we still feel the reverberations. And in fact, an event that's directly connected to the most significant, most monumental thing that will define the future of humanity, the rise and the return of the Imam of the time, the Savior. So, insofar as the theological implications of the event, those details are important, and it would be wonderful for us to reach definitive answers for these questions. However, insofar as these questions impact on the tragic side of the martyrdom of Imam al-Hussein, they're inconsequential.
Sure.
Right? It doesn't really matter exactly how old Abdullah al-Radi' was, whether he was 6 months old or 6 months and 2 weeks old. Like you said, Ali al-Akbar, his exact age, how many children he had. Those things don't really factor into.
It doesn't change what happened.
It doesn't change what happened, exactly.
Yeah.
And so for people to try and use these discrepancies, if you like, or these gaps, these holes, to paint a picture that the entire narrative is questionable, is it's an act of injustice. It's disingenuous. It's wrong, right? And it's just it's unacademic, right?
Yeah,
because ultimately, the story of Imam al-Hussein is half. If we were to divide it into two parts, one part would be about the objectives, the morals, the inspiration of Imam al-Hussein, why he did what he did, and what he represents to us, how we can be inspired by him, how we can use the legend of Imam al-Hussein to get closer to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala through the Imam. And on the other hand, it's about the macabre, heartrending tragedy that befell the family of Rasulullah. And those details really don't affect either of these two aspects.
Interesting.
Said, if I can add to this narrative and this Maqtal discussion that we're having here, and I think misconceptions sometimes can stem from ourselves, from Shias themselves. And one thing I've noticed every year, and I think we bring this up before the podcast as well, is, for example, some believe it's possibly culturally, did it happen, did it not happen? I don't know the answer to this completely myself. For example, we have the example of the wedding of Qasim Ibn Hassan, alayhi afdal salatu wassalam. Did he get married on Ashura? I've heard some people say he got married on that day, nikah-wise only, then it happened. Some say, no, he wanted to get married, there was an intention. Some say there was no such thing as a wedding at all. How can we answer this? Because in Iraqi culture, and I'm sharing culture here, saying that we sort of take this culturally, we give entire nights to this. For example, when it comes to, for example, theatrical plays in our senses, or for example, holding candles and distributing sweets in the name of Qasim Ibn Hassan. What's the reason behind all of this? Did it happen? Firstly, I want to. Okay. I'm asking this question.
Did it happen?
Yeah.
As far as I can tell, no.
Okay.
So was there a wedding held on the day of Ashura? No. But, and I think this is important.
Yeah.
Ultimately, the grief that we express for the martyrs of Karbala is based on the actual tragedies that took place, but also the unrealized dreams.
Okay.
Yeah.
And I think most people, especially those from the Indian subcontinent, but also in Iran and Iraq and places like these, they'll say the same thing. I think most people recognize that you couldn't possibly have a wedding on the day of Ashura, even if it's like a very simplistic, very basic thing. But that's how they view it. They feel that Qasim, this young boy, a lot of times you see pregnant women, their baby's not even born yet, but they're already thinking about, maybe when he grows up, he'll get married to his cousin, like my sister's girl, she's so nice, or she's also pregnant with her baby daughter. And so every mother is always, she's always, she has all these hopes and dreams for her child. And so when people talk about Qasim's wedding, really what it's about at its very core is Ramla's unrealized hopes and dreams for her son. If that's how we view it, then distributing sweets in the name of Qasim, there's nothing wrong with it. Or carrying, I don't know what they call it, like in India and Pakistan, they have this thing in Iraq and Iran, I think they call it hijla, right? This thing that they carry around. Is that like heretical? Is that Qubbat al-Qasim? Ahsan. Is that heretical? Is that an insult to Imam Hussain or to Qasim or to Sukaina? Absolutely not. Because it's about the unrealized hopes and dreams. It's about the potential that was never reached. It's about the fact that had Qasim grown to get married and have kids, that would have been, one of the main bloodlines for Imam al-Hassan alayhi salam and all of these Sayyids who could have come into this world, who could have been productive, members of society, who could have achieved great things. And so is that a reason to lament and to cry and to grieve? Absolutely.
Yeah.
Right? But my issue is when people make a big deal out of it.
Yeah.
Especially people who,
Because I've seen it on Twitter this year.
Yeah.
Huge discussion.
It's like, yeah, these are all, fabrications and whatnot. What do you mean fabrications? What exactly are we doing? Giving out sweets or, or doing henna and things like that? Nobody's saying that that's what happened on the day of Ashura, right? It's about lamenting the unrealized hopes.
Yeah.
It's about crying for the fact that this crime was made so much worse because it took place against a 13-year-old boy who could have grown up and gotten married, perhaps to the daughter of Imam al-Hussain, which would have carried, a sacred bloodline from both Imam al-Hassan and Imam al-Hussain, right? Let's not make a big deal out of it. If somebody wants to, do this and remember it and even talk about some, marriage that could have potentially happened, or they might actually believe that it did. Fine.
Yeah.
Fine. What's the big deal? Like you said, it doesn't change anything, does it?
Yeah.
It doesn't change the fact that Imam al-Hussein's tragedy was the peak. It was the ultimate catastrophe.
Sayed, a final question from me, specifically in regards to post Ashura. In the 10 nights of Muharram, we of course exhibit a high emotional status in ourselves, and we kind of put forward our most vulnerable selves to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And in these 10 nights, when we exhibit these, of course, we have questions from our brothers and sisters from other schools of thought as to why we are so emotional. But then also after Ashura ends, the questions come as to, look, Imam Hussain has died. We know from our hadith, the Holy Prophet Muhammad said about mourning for 3 days and whatnot. Why do we continue to mourn Imam al-Hussain alayhi salam? Why do we go back on the 40th and Arba'een? Why across the year do we remember the tragedy of al-Hussain on Thursday nights? So in some communities, even in weddings, like you mentioned, Said, we talk about Imam al-Hussain. And is there a need for us to do that or not? So that's a question from me.
What's the point of the tears? I think is what Muhammad is saying.
So I think we need to decide whether we want to take a rational approach or a textual approach. The difference obviously being that if you want to take a textual approach, then you need to go back and see what the Imam said about this, how they practiced the tragedy, or they commemorated the tragedy of Imam al-Hussain. And if you take this route, then the answer is very simple. The Imams, starting with the Holy Prophet himself, clearly wanted the tragedy of Imam al-Hussain to be commemorated with utmost vigor and passion. In fact, the verse in the Quran is clear about this. ذَلِكَ وَمَنْ يُعَظِّمْ شَعَائِرَ اللَّهِ فَإِنَّهَا مِنْ تَقْوَى الْقُلُوبِ. Whoever revives, See, God could have said, ذَلِكَ وَمَنْ يُحْيِي شَعَائِرَ اللَّهِ. Whoever revives them. God could have said, وَمَنْ يُقِيمُ شَعَائِرَ اللَّهِ. Whoever upholds them. But he doesn't say that. The verse says, يُعَظِّم. Amplify, glorify, hold it with the highest esteem and passion. Ta'zim. Azim means great. And so the Quran says this. Then you come to the words of the Prophet. it's a famous hadith when Fatima Zahra, I mentioned it in, I think, the first night of the series in Muharram, where the Prophet tells Fatima Zahra, they have a conversation. Fatima Zahra asks a question. He says, Ya Rasulullah, this boy talks to me. Just like she did when she was in the womb of the blessed Lady Khadija alayha salatu wassalam, where she would comfort and console her mother because she was abandoned by everybody. Imam al-Hussein was speaking to Fatima Zahra. So the Prophet says, what does he say? And she said, he constantly says, Ana al-gharib, Ana al-atshan, Ana al-madloom. What's that all about? And so the Prophet says to his daughter that your son's going to be killed and he'll be deserted, he'll be all alone, and eventually he'll be massacred along with his family. So Fatima Zahra says, if that's the case, then I don't want him to come into this world. You know, it's like sometimes you meet people who, let's say, you know, you're in Iraq and you lost your son. You're a mother and you had a son who was killed by Saddam. Then you come and see all the corruption, and you'll see all the neglect of religious values. And as a mother, it's well within your right to say, you know what? I feel like my boy, you know, he went to waste. Like, you know, these people don't deserve him. Fatima Zahra felt the same way about Imam al-Hussein. It's like, I don't want my son to be wasted. He's too great. He was one of the lights that circumambulated God's throne. هللنا وهللت الملائكة سبحنا وسبحت الملائكة. They were teaching the angels how to glorify and honor Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. For him to come into this world to be treated like this, maybe it's best if he doesn't come into this world. And so the Prophet tells her that, you know, there's a plan that Allah has for Imam al-Hussein. He's going to be the ark of salvation, the lantern of guidance, and ultimately it is from his lineage that the Mahdi will come, and so forth. Then the question that Fatima Zahra asks the Prophet is, will we be around? And the Prophet says, no, it'll be at a time when I'm gone and you're gone and his brother is gone, his father is gone. And so she then says, will anyone mourn him? Will anyone cry for him? So the Prophet says that the men will cry for the men, the women will cry for the women. And from the moment before Imam al-Hussein is born, the Prophet is saying, people will cry for Hussein. And if Allah allows us to be manifestations of this hadith, in itself is the greatest honor. Yeah. For us to cry, look, you know, think about the issue of tears from this perspective. Our entire religion is based on what? The hadith famously declares, and this is exclusive to the Shia school and to the Ahlul Bayt school of thought. When the Imams say أَلَيْسَ الدِّينُ إِلَّا الْحُبِّ, religion is nothing but love. Now think about this. If you loved someone, truly loved them, and you lost them, wouldn't you cry for them? Now, our love for the Prophet and his household is beyond and above. It supersedes our love for anybody else, or at least that's how it should be. So when you see someone crying for Imam Hussein, would you blame them? Or would you praise them? You would say, you know what? That means that you have such a special bond with Rasulullah, right? And his household, that you now can't control your emotions. You have an emotional outpour based on that love. It's spontaneous. It's not something you decide to do, right? It's not a mechanical thing where it's like, you know what, let me sit down and cry. Yeah. It doesn't work that way. Anybody who's cried for Imam Hussein knows they do that because they establish that there is that spark. You make a connection and it just flows out.
Yeah.
Right? That, I think, is a simple way of looking at it. Why do we do it? Because every time we hear the story, we're reminded of just how difficult it was, not just for Imam al-Hussein, but for Fatima Zahra, for Imam Ali, for Imam al-Hassan, for Lady Zainab, the tragedy that continued and continues to this very day. Right? Imam al-Hussein is neglected. Imam al-Hussein, the vast majority of Muslims, it's like this convert was saying, like, we always think of Imam al-Hassan and Imam al-Hussein as kids. Because all the stories we've heard about them are stories when they were around the Prophet and whatnot. Well, what about the Imam when he grew older and became an adult? Imam al-Hussein is neglected. They think of a lot of the, graded companions as being superior to Imam al-Hassan and Imam al-Hussein. If not in how they describe the different tiers, at least in practice, Imam al-Hussein took a back seat as far as the mainstream Muslims are concerned. We feel a bond with Imam al-Hussein, and this bond is God-given. It's a gift that Allah has given us, and it's based on that we can't help but remember him and mourn for him and cry for him, which is exactly what Rasulullah would do had he been here. Wouldn't the Prophet do that?
Yeah.
Right? Anniversaries. Like, imagine a mother loses her child in a really tragic way. Every year on that day, what does that mother do? She cries. She remembers. She mourns. If the Prophet was here today, would he not cry for Imam al-Hussein? He would. And so would anyone blame us if we cried along with Rasulullah? If we offered condolences to the Holy Prophet? Ahsanallah alaykum. We'll have more of them in the coming days and weeks and months. Inshallah.
Sayyid Mahdi, thank you very much.
Jazakumullah khair.
Everyone at home, thank you for tuning in. And do not forget to, of course, hit that like and subscribe button. Follow us on TikTok, on Instagram, wherever, of course, you also get your podcast, whether it's Apple or Spotify or even Google. Inshallah, we will be back as always next week. We will see you then. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
Alaykum assalam wa rahmatullah.